All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. This program is being recorded, and you guys will get a link to the video so you can watch it afterwards. If you'd like to refresh on any information, and again, the PowerPoint slides are in the chat box. If you have any questions, you're welcome to use that chat box. I'll try and answer them as we're going through the presentation, and we'll also have some time at the end for questions as well. So the first thing I want to talk about today is who I am. My name is Alicia Halbritter, and I am the livestock and agriculture natural resources agent in Baker County, Florida, which is just west of Jacksonville. And I do a lot of management with wildlife, particularly in the realm of deer and some stuff with other wildlife as well. We do a lot of work with timber plantations and such, and hunting camps that want to manage their deer specifically for hunting. So we're going to go through a lot of this conversation today is going to be focused on private lands, but I can give some recommendations for public lands as well, if that's where you typically hunt. So the first thing I want to talk about today is the forage preferences for deer. So what do Florida deer actually like to eat? And a lot of people don't realize that they do have particular preferences, especially in a certain order. So their first order of preferences is going to be hard mast. This is going to typically be seeds from hardwood trees like acorns. This is going to be their number one go-to preference for food. Soft masts are going to be their second. So these are going to be your soft fruits and stuff. Persimmon fruits are a favorite. Beauty berries, blackberries, things like that with a soft fruit on them. Third is going to be forbs. So that's what we're going to focus on as producers because that's what we can easily plant and manage. And we'll go in some in-depth stuff with some forbs there. But even natural forbs like clover, grasses, just herbaceous materials in the forest is going to be their third preference. And then fourth, they're going to look for browse, which are going to be your like greenbrier vines, wild grapevines, twigs, things like that. This is going to be a focus more in the winter when there's not a whole lot of other foliage around. So when we're looking at deer management, just some general tips are going to be that they prefer hardwood canopies over just 100% timber pine management. So if you're looking specifically to manage for deer, I always recommend to interseed hardwoods or keep hardwoods in at about a 30% ratio of the forest. Obviously, if we're managing just for timber, this isn't really ideal. They're not going to want hardwoods there in the forest. So it's not a requirement, but we'd like to see that you keep at least some hardwoods on the edges or maybe have a designated hunting area that you're going to maintain some population of hardwoods in there. Again, remember that hard mass, those acorns and such, are the number one preference of food for deer. So we want to keep those somewhere in our property so we know those deer are going to come there and stay there. Also, it's important to use diverse species of hardwoods, so not just one particular oak, but using different types of hardwoods throughout or managing those populations. You can plant them specifically for deer in particular areas. Maintaining openings within the property is going to be really important. So we want to have a mix of herbaceous and shrub species in the forest openings, so not just 10 acres of straight planted pines. They need some type of different variety of food sources. So they're not just going to, although they do have a preference of order of food, deer are naturally browsers, which means they kind of take a bite and move on, take a bite and move on, and they like to have a variety of foods available to them. And this is really going to help when we'll talk about our annual calendar, is having forages available or food sources available year-round for the deer. So leaving spaces about 1 to 5 acres in size, depending on your total land size, is going to be really important for those herbaceous and shrub species to come through and provide a food source for the deer. Third, we want to manage our canopy story, and the canopy opening is going to be really important. Deer don't necessarily like 100% closed canopy. It's not really good for timber management either, and it's especially not good for managing the underbrush and promoting those herbaceous and shrub species in the forest floor. So make sure we're managing our tree spacing, have proper harvesting techniques if we're doing third row harvesting and such in our timber to open up that canopy, allow for that sunlight to come through and promote growth in the understory. You can also do this with mowing or roller chopping every now and then. And I highly recommend prescribed fire for wildlife management. There's nothing better that I've found to manage the species the plant species that these wildlife prefer. You'll see in a prescribed fire, I mean, I've seen deer hop over the fire and go into the burned areas and just start consuming the vegetation there. So they really like prescribed fire. It's a really great tool for not only timber management, but also wildlife management. You also need to maintain the kind of odd areas of your operation, whether that be just, an area you're designated for hunting or a true timber management plantation. There's going to be ditches, roads that you're managing, the sides of those roads, corners of your food plots or corners of, any type of field or something that you have there. And all of these need to include a diversity of plant species. They just don't need to let them just grow up and have no management, because that's going to promote a lot of weeds and such that may not be a preference for deer. So I always like to say, keep an eye on those odd areas, make sure you're maintaining them, mowing them if necessary, planting particular species there that deer or turkey or whatever wildlife you're trying to manage are going to enjoy. If you're on private lands, which I assume most of you are, if you're managing your deer herd specifically, you're going to really want to take advantage of feeders, whether that be automatic feeders that you're using with grain corn, or whether you're using whole corn on the cob in like a trough style feeder. Any of those are going to be great for maintaining nutritional planes. I like to recommend a deer ration or a chow rather than just one single grain like corn. Corn is a great attractant. It's not a super great nutritional item for these deer. So we want to make sure that we're providing for them. We'll talk a little bit about that later on, but that we're fulfilling those nutritional needs of these deer and not just bringing them to an area to be able to hunt them. Obviously, feeders are highly utilized already by hunters just as an attractant to get the deer, in your line of sight from your stand, but always utilize them year round when we're looking at proper deer management. One feeder can serve approximately 30 deer or 150 acres. Most likely you're going to have more than one feeder in a 150 acre area. If you're doing some true deer management, you probably have multiple stands set up and you're using feeders at each of those stands. And we'll talk specifically about food plots today. I am a proponent of food plots. I love what they do for deer management and deer nutrition. They're great to hunt off of, and they're a really easy way to manage the deer nutritional plane year round and just manage what needs to be done for our deer. So I like to plant at least 1 to 3 acres food plots each. And it needs to cover at least about 3% of your property, and that'll help us promote that diversity of food sources, those different types of hard mass in your hardwood forest canopies, your soft mass in the underbrush, and then your herbs, herbaceous species and forages in your food plots. So when we're looking at developing a food plots, there's 3 things that we need to focus on: the soil, the seeds, and the equipment that we're going to utilize. When we're talking about soil, I see a lot of people over liming, and lime is what we utilize to adjust the pH of our soils. It's not something that we need to do every year. we need to be taking soil tests and determine what the pH of our soil is. It's a cheap test for the UF lab. It's $10. You get your pH measurement. You also get a bunch of nutrient measurements in there and specific recommendations on if lime is needed, and fertilizer and what fertilization recommendations you need for the specific things that you're planting. A lot of the plants that we utilize for wildlife food plots like a lower pH, so we don't want to be liming and raising that pH to where they're not going to be growing in their best condition there. So make sure we're not applying lime unless we take a soil test and that soil test recommends the lime. For fertilization, we want to make sure we're utilizing proper fertilization rates. The timing is going to be the key for that. So I've seen some people like fertilize in spring, getting ready for their fall forage plots, and we're getting a ton of rain over the summer. You've already washed all that fertilizer away and waste all that money. So only fertilize when plants are actively growing. I even like to come in, you can fertilize at planting. Most people will come back and try and fertilize 2 to 3 weeks after planting to make sure that those plants have germinated and come up and can utilize the nutrients that are in that fertilizer. That's going to be, an expense. If you're willing to make that expense for forage plots, it's going to really help them get up and grow and sustain the growth that's going to be needed if they're going to be heavily grazed by deer. And again, just reiterating that soil testing should be done annually. If you're planting forages multiple times a year, I would recommend doing it before every planting. That $7 to $10 is really going to help you just kind of get those recommendations perfect. And so we're not spending more money than we need to fertilize or lime or such. And that's going to get you the most bang for your buck and be the most cost effective for you. When it comes to seeds, we want to make sure we're really focusing on the varieties of seeds that we're planting. So we see a lot of like nationwide companies in feed stores and such. And I just always caution, especially for Florida, purchasing those because they're generally full of varieties that may work really well in Texas or up north where they have a lot more buyers of food plots. And the species may be okay for Florida, but the specific varieties in those bags may not be. And so always purchase varieties that have done research and recommendations in the state of Florida. UF comes out with an annual publication with every variety of every recommended species that we have, and you can purchase your seeds accordingly to that. Make sure you have a proper planting rate when you're looking at planting these varieties, especially if you're doing a mix of varieties. That planting rate is going to be really important when we're looking at seeding, large seeds like cowpeas or oats and things like that, and mixing that with clovers, which are really tiny, tiny seeds. We want to make sure we're getting our planting rate and our mixes great on those, so we have a great variety in our forage stand and making sure that they all germinate properly. Too many seeds leads to too much competition. Your fertilization rates aren't going to be right, and that's going to result in lower yields overall. And again, we want to get the most bang for our buck here, and so we want that planting rate to be really specific and ideal for the species that we're utilizing. That publication that comes out every year from UF with our cool season variety recommendations also includes planting rates, so make sure we're just keeping an eye on that. Make sure that we're planting at appropriate times. So this is going to be really important if we're using cool season forages or warm season forages. We don't want to plant too early or too late. That's not going to give us the ideal forage stand. So typically in Florida, when we're looking at planting cool season forages, you're going to be planting between October 15th and November 15th are most of the recommendations UF has. For our warm season forages, they kind of range, but typically we're looking, anywhere from April to June in planting in those. The moisture is going to be really important for our warm season forages. But just make sure that, we're planning really well for our varieties that we're picking, the species that we're picking, how we're going to plant those, when we're going to plant those, and making sure our lime and fertilizer and soil conditions are right. So we have that ideal stand. The planning on that is going to be crucial to making sure you have a great stand. As far as equipment, this is really going to be a personal choice for you into what you use, what kind of cost you want to utilize for those. Obviously, we don't want to go out and buy like a $40,000 tractor just to hunt on if you're, just trying to reduce your food costs or such, because that's going to make the cost of your deer meat very expensive. So if it's something that's just a hobby for you, then, you're really just going to have to determine what's financially feasible for you as far as what type of equipment you're going to purchase and utilize. And that can determine what you're actually able to do in the way of managing the deer, particularly with planting food plots. When you do purchase that equipment, make sure that we're maintaining it year round, and particularly going through just before planting season and making sure that that equipment is up to date. All of our fluids are full, belts are in good condition, fuel lines are good, such like that. Blades are sharpened, anything of that sort. And that the equipment is clean, especially after we may have gone through an area that was heavy in weeds. If there's any weed seeds and plant materials there, I always like to blow that off or wash that off of my equipment before I leave an area, and so I don't spread those seeds to another area. This maintenance of your equipment is going to increase the longevity and the use of that product, and just get you, again, the most cost effectiveness for it. Making sure that we're purchasing equipment that not only is good for one use, but is good for a multitude of uses. That's going to make it a lot more cost effective for us, and just labor effectiveness as well. We don't have to be jumping off one piece of equipment and getting onto another. It's going to reduce the cost associated with maintenance and such as well. And again, just reduce the overall cost of planting these forage plots. So choose equipment that's going to help you achieve your goals and hopefully have a multitude of uses. So why do we need to focus on year-round management of our deer? A lot of people who are truly passionate about hunting and deer management really are looking either for those big bucks, we're either looking at antler size or just meat size. But hunting is not about just meat in the freezer. When you're looking at from a hobbyist standpoint, you really need to manage those deer on a year-round basis to get the things that you're looking for out of your herd. So we're looking at our antlers. Bucks are putting on antlers in the spring, they're shedding velvet in the summer, and then dropping antlers in the winter to early spring. So that proper nutrition all year round is going to lead to those nice big antlers. Obviously, genetics plays a role in that, age of the buck plays a role in that, but nutrition is really important. If they don't have a good nutritional plane in the spring, or even a good nutritional plane in the rut, then those antlers just don't have the opportunity to grow to what they need to be, even if they have premier genetics and just, great buck size and such. They might have smaller antlers because they have poor nutrition. And of course, we're looking at long-term management of our herd as well. So healthy babies is going to be really important. The breeding season can be really rough on does as they're moving throughout and then carrying a pregnancy, and really rough on bucks who are running around chasing does. Food plots can help them maintain that weight and nutrition. It can help them rebuild that weight and nutrition and prepare for overwintering, and also just put on weight for the hunting season when we're looking at harvesting a deer. Those does are lactating in the spring and summer. That's really hard on them nutritionally. They just may not be able to find enough nutrition in the forest to maintain their own weight and condition, and then also provide for a fawn or multiple fawns. So we want to make sure that we're planting warm season forages for them to maintain those high nutritional needs during that time, And so they can perform really well during the breeding season and carry a healthy pregnancy and maintain those good genetics into the next year. So when we're looking at an annual calendar for our deer, there's a few, we're just kind of go by month and focus on some particular things. January is going to be a grazing period for our cool season forages. We could potentially fertilize if needed, depending on when you planted those forages or if they're just getting grazed really heavily. This is a time period when you should be scouting for weeds, scout for barren areas in the food plot, determine why those might be barren. Was it a mistake during planting? Was it a mistake during the prep of the area? Is there a lot of water holding there that we need to focus on next year and doing some grading or ditching? Those are going to be really important for the long-term management of your food plot areas. During February, we're going to be grazing the deer again. Some later maturing varieties will be coming into maturity now and either reseeding out or starting on that slow decline down. February is when I would recommend a soil test if you're intending on planting warm season forages. That way we can get it back in time and we can go ahead and lime if needed and get our fertilization plan in place. In March, you may potentially see some grazing of the late maturing varieties, but it'll be really declining, particularly if we get some of that early heat. Our cool season forages will really start declining around this time period. If your soil test determined that your pH was too low and you needed to raise it for the crops that you're intending on planting, this is when you would want to lime. Lime can take 6 months or longer to actually start changing the pH of our soil. So we want to do that really ahead of time before our intended planting dates. So if you're looking at planting cool season forages for the very first time, February is a great time to go ahead and soil test so we know that pH ahead of time and know if we need to lime in advance. In April, we're going to look at potentially planting our warm season perennials or annuals. We're going to start that planning process for those and may do some early planting at the end of April, but likely we'll wait till May depending on the weather. And then we're going to start scouting for warm season weeds and control as needed in these areas. During May, we should be planting our warm season annuals. Most likely we'll be planted by the end of the month. Of course, this is going to depend on weather. We really need some good water and rain, and sometimes that can be a dry period for us here in North Florida at least. We're going to be maintaining our scouting for weeds, and if we planted in April, we're going to want to go ahead and fertilize our warm season annuals or perennials there. In June, we can start our early grazing of those warm seasons. We're going to be scouting for weeds again, controlling if necessary to maintain that competition with our planted species. And if you planted in May, this is when you would want to fertilize. In July, we're going to be really into our grazing period of those warm season annuals. Again, we're going to be scouting for weeds, and we're going to start looking for our seed source for our cool season forages. Some of our varieties can be really hard to get a hold of. And so if you're looking at planting those, we want to make sure that we're purchasing those or securing the purchase of those months in advance. And that just really helps us start in that planning process as well. So we know ahead of time everything that needs to get done ahead of planting those cool season forages. In August, we're going to be grazing those warm seasons still. We should have our cool season forage seeds secured at this point and start performing any equipment maintenance, particularly if this equipment is only utilized for food plots and it's been sitting for a year. We want to make sure we're looking over that and getting it ready to plant. In September, we're still likely grazing some of our warm season forages, particularly if there are later maturing varieties. This is when we would want a soil test to determine our fertility for cool season forages, so we know what fertilizer we need to purchase for planting those particular varieties or species that we're looking at. I like to set up my game cameras in particular areas here. This helps me determine an estimated grazing stress. So I generally recommend utilizing cameras year round. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But if you're not using them year round, then definitely start in August or September in those areas of your food plots. This helps us determine how many deer are actually coming and grazing, how many might be utilizing those cool season forages. It can help us determine what species we need to plant and when we need to plant, and also our planting rates if we need to plant at a higher density because we know they're going to be experiencing high grazing stress. October, we're really going to start to see the decline of those warm season grasses. We're likely going to till these under in most situations, but no-till planting is an option once those start to decline and go into dormancy. And you can start your potential to plant your cool season forages during this time. Again, like I said, typically we recommend between October 15th and November 15th for our cool season forage plantings. So in November, we like to plant before Thanksgiving, those cool season forages to avoid that potential frost damage. You never know with Florida. I mean, we could have 90, 80-degree temperatures all the way till the end of December. So that planting time really can range. Obviously, we're in peak hunting season at this point in time between November and December. So planting during that time period isn't going to do you a whole lot of good because you're not really increasing their nutritional plane at that point. You may just be using it as an attractant to keep the deer in the line of sight of your stand. In November, you can fertilize at planting for those cool season forages, or you can wait till December, depending on what your situation is, and fertilize then. We should be utilizing those forages in December if we planted in October or November. And we're going to start scouting for weeds for our cool seasons, controlling if necessary, and then just starting that calendar all over again. So you can see there's really something to do every month of the year in these situations. If you're really looking at long-term management of your deer and great food plot stands, we really have to be out there every month managing those areas, whether you're planting or not. So some potential forage options that deer do prefer. For our warm seasons, we have a number of legumes available. So ashenotomy, Alice clover, cowpeas, soybeans, or perennial peanut. It's also called rhizoma peanut. These are all annual plants, except rhizoma peanut is a perennial. Legumes are a great option. They harvest nitrogen and deposit that back into the soil, and so it will reduce your fertilization needs. These seeds can be a little more expensive, but they are a great option. They are great nutrition for our deer as well, so I really like the legumes in our warm season mixes. There are a couple grasses like Japanese millet, which is an annual. Some people will plant Bahia grass, but I just caution that because one, it's not really a huge preference for deer as far as grazing. They're not really huge grass grazers. And Bahia grass has a tendency to become a weed and compete with our cool season forages or with our warm season annuals that we're looking at planting. So just be cautious when mixing that in. It's great for like roadside areas, corners of the fields, stuff like that to maintain those odd areas that we talked about earlier. Cool season forages are probably what a lot of you are going to focus on. We have a number of cool season forages available. Legumes in particular that deer we've researched and they prefer is vetch. You can also hear this called deer vetch. Winter peas, clovers, and alfalfa they do prefer, but it's a difficult plant for us to grow. So I would just be cautious on planting alfalfa. But the vetch, winter peas, and clovers all have tremendous success with deer, tremendous success all over the state of Florida, and a lot of varieties available for those for you to plant. And again, those are legumes preferred over the grasses, or incorporate those in a mix with the grasses. For grasses, we have your traditional cool season. What people think of is our oats, our rye, our wheat, our ryegrass, which is different from rye, which is a cereal grain, and triticale, which is kind of a mix hybrid breed there. So those are all really great, preferred by deer as well. And we generally see those in mixes with legumes, although some people will just do a grass mix in their food plot or one single grass. Some other options that are really great for deer as well are Brassica species. And so these are kind of like our pole crops. Deer really like these, and they do really well as a ground cover to prevent weeds as well. So we have species like kale, rape, turnip, swede, daikon radishes, and forage chicory. These can also be really good, particularly the daikon radishes and the turnips, to break up soil compaction. So if you have an area that's had a lot of log trucks through or a lot of tractors through or such, and you have difficulty growing other species, the daikon radish and the turnips obviously produce good root vegetables, which the deer really like. And if you have a hog issue, the hogs really like those as well. So it's great to attract the hogs there if you're trying to mitigate and control those. But those species are really good. You do have to be kind of cautious with those and frost because they can get kind of bitter, particularly near the end of the season, and then deer won't really like those. So if you're mixing those in with your other forages, just be conscious of that as well. So keep in mind with your food plots when you're looking at setting these up, the size of them, generally about 1 to 3 acres. Large plots are generally underutilized. Again, deer are just not big grazers in particular. They're a take one bite and go, take one bite and go. So, don't think you're going to go and plant a 10-acre forage plot and the deer are just going to come through and graze it all. The location of that is going to be really particular as well. The annual species are highly subjected to stress, so make sure we're choosing a location that doesn't get flooded for a long period of time, especially in our warm season annuals, because that's when our typical hurricane season and rainy season is. So if we're getting a lot of rain like we are right now and you have flooding, those warm seasons are not going to perform and they may potentially just completely fail. The shape of your plot should also be a thought process for you. Deer prefer to feed on the edge of the plots. They are a prey species, and so they don't really like to stand out in the wide open. They like skinny rectangular plots that they can stay on the edges. That helps you maintain more use of the plot as well, because they're going to stay on those edges, which is, maybe go a few feet into the plot, 20 or 30 feet. I've seen some go further as well, but they really like those long, skinny areas or kind of oddly shaped ones. They don't like a big square or any big open areas. So just be conscious of that. So there are just some photos here for you to kind of get an idea of those cool season forages. You can see this large one here at the top is a bunch of different grasses. We have some oats, I believe, on the far right, and ryegrass in the middle. And you can see that these were all planted at the exact same time. They've all had the same management, and there's a bunch of different levels of yield in these species and varieties. So that's going to be really important on your use of these. Some of them are going to be really low, some of them are going to be really high. And be conscious of that when you're mixing these together, because those high ones may shade or compete with the plants that have a lower plant height. There's also options like our clovers and such. If we're not managing these, they sometimes don't fill in all the way. So just, be aware of that. It may not be a full stand, and that's why we really like to mix those with some of our grasses and other species. They do get quite tall. Some of our clovers can get, over 2 feet in height, approaching, 2.5 feet and such. So this is, of course, if they're not being heavily grazed, but it does provide a lot of forage and a lot of yield for our deer as well. And then this is just a photo of a typical grain drill or planter that you would use to actually seed it. A lot of these species can be broadcast seeded as well, which would be much cheaper for you than purchasing a grain drill. So when we're looking at actual harvest or taking of the deer, that's going to be a factor of your management plan as well. We want to make sure that we're harvesting for long-term management of our deer herd and not just for the here and now or right now. So when we're looking at antler size, don't just look at the FWC minimums and say, oh, you know, it has, it meets the requirements, so I'm going to take the deer. We want to really allow bucks to grow out over a period of years. We want to maintain those bucks that have superior genetics. If you harvest those deer, then they're not breeding, they're not passing on those genetics to the future generations. So, you know, maybe keep those really well-performing bucks for 2, 3, 5 years, or maybe, you know, keep one forever and don't harvest it and just harvest those medium range or low range bucks the first few years. And that allows you to just increase the superior genetics in the herd that's on your property in making sure that they're passing on those big antler sizes. Of course, nutrition and maintaining those forages is going to really help with that as well. For our does, utilize that doe harvesting time. In my area, we only have one weekend, so you have to be, you know, really on top of it there. But that helps manage our doe populations, and you can harvest poor genetics. So if you know a doe that just, you know, never really produces great fawns are always scrawny or early in the season or too late in the season, managing those does can be really helpful. And the best thing that you can do, which kind of takes some time and kind of takes some thought process to it, but is maintaining records. This is why, again, I like to use cameras year round. It really helps me see how large my deer herd is throughout the year, how many bucks are, you know, coming. I can prepare for the hunting season by knowing how many bucks I've seen on my camera, what kind of quality those bucks were, their antler sizes and such. You can try and estimate, you know, the population sizes, where they're hanging out, where they are, move those cameras around your property. Are they visiting certain feeders? Are they staying in certain low areas? Are they moving to certain areas during the breeding season? And really getting those records and maintaining that year after year can be really helpful. Keep a record of how many deer you've harvested and factor that into your populations. Keep records on what the quality of the deer you've harvested were. If you're harvesting does during doe weekend, were they pregnant? And that can help you kind of double check to see, you know, what your population growth may be. All those records can be utilized for different things, but they're really important. And again, just utilizing those cameras year round to keep track is a really great thing. And then, of course, keeping records of the bucks that you're harvesting, what size antlers there were, maybe even an approximate age, if you've seen them on camera a few times throughout the years or such. And that can be really helpful for just determining your genetics and where your herd might be going in the next few years. So I'd be happy to take some questions about deer management, or really anything you have in regards to wild management. You're welcome to put those in the chat or unmute yourself and ask some questions. I am going to post a survey link in the chat here if you'd like to go ahead and take it now, but it also will be emailed to you for this program, and you'll be emailed the slides and the recording as well if you'd like to go back and watch it or share it with anybody. So you are welcome to ask questions now.